The Celts were the first European people north of the Alps to rise from anonymity. The first phase in their long history was named after a lakeside village in Austria, Hallstatt. The second phase would be named after a lakeside village in Switzerland. Never an empire, the Celts were a great civilization. A civilization that was almost obliterated by an empire. From the early days in Central Europe, the influence of the Celts spilt over the Alps. The amazing galleries of rock art in Val Camonica, northern Italy, show many simple domestic scenes, houses. But there might have been a ritual purpose to them as well. There are strange hunting scenes. Warriors, some with exaggerated phallic displays. Even scenes of zoophilia. The funeral bier of the Hallstatt princes is here, the four-wheeled wagon. Ritual dances, or as say some, mothers in childbirth. The true meaning of this art eludes us. But for the people who created it, it must have had great significance. For in this part of Lombardy, no fewer than 13 galleries of rock art have already been discovered, many of them dating from the Celtic period. But it is a crude, primitive art. Then here, in present-day Switzerland, Lake Neuchâtel yielded its secrets. The summer of 1857 had been unusually dry. Water level fell, and at a site named La Tène, strange timber piles surfaced. They came to the attention of Friedrich Schwab, a noted archaeologist who realized they might be important. Excavations, drainage, and more excavations followed. The timbers of an ancient bridge or staging post were discovered. For over a quarter of a century, they explored. Their dedication was rewarded as thousands of artifacts were discovered, including 160 iron swords. Spearheads, some deliberately mutilated. La Tène was a religious site, the artifacts, offerings to the gods. But there was more to excite the archaeologists than the number of finds. These pieces were showing new forms, designs, and a unique art style. By the beginning of the 20th century, the La Tène site had given its name to the second phase of Celtic development. North of the Alps, the social structure remained much the same, with hill forts and warrior chiefs. Chiefs who were still buried, they and their families, in royal tombs. These tombs in Rheinheim near Saarbrücken in southwest Germany were to yield treasures with a difference. superbly crafted jewelry, the metalwork showing an advanced artistic style, beautiful and intricate. It was named Celtic art. This was no copy of styles from the south. It was influenced by the Greeks and the Etruscans, yes, but it had a vitality and originality of its own. It spread over a wide area of Europe and is characterized by swirling patterns and motifs. Often vegetal-style patterns. Elsewhere within the patterns, shapes and faces. Strange creatures, part animal, part human. On occasions, the artwork is in a sort of dream world, sometimes nightmarish. Here, a human head leads to an animal's tail, and the animal in turn has a human head in its jaw. The artist's craft and imagination is staggeringly complex. It is the art of the elite. It expresses authority. Art is often inspired by an individual or a school. Was there such a dominant person or center in the Celtic world?
Il est hors de doute qu'à l'époque celtique, il y avait des artistes reconnus par leur groupe et exceptionnellement doués, en particulier dans la ciselure, dans l'orfèvrerie, dans ces arts dits quelquefois mineurs et qui nécessitent une très haute capacité technique et en même temps un sens parfait de la ligne. Donc les artistes, nous demeureront anonymes, nous ne savons pas leur nom, mais ils existent et c'était vraiment des maîtres.
The warrior burials were changing too. No wagon here, but a two-wheeled chariot. There seems at times to be a stronger emphasis on warfare. Spears and swords are now not so much display pieces. Other things are similar, always wine. And food, the joint of pork. The jewelry and ornaments. Buried with this individual, his slave perhaps. They had entered another world. So had Celtic society. From the middle of the 5th century BC, there was a breakdown in that society. The great hill fort, Mont Lassois, was abandoned. So were others. The Heuneberg hill fort, overlooking the Danube Valley, was affected. Archaeologists working here have discovered telltale signs. Charcoal-filled strata show that on several occasions the fort was burned to the ground. These were pretty drastic measures. We know also from classical writers that hundreds of thousands of Celts were pouring southwards from Central Europe. Why?
We know from classical sources, from archaeology, that there was this enormous outpouring of people from north of the Alps, somewhere around about 400 BC, plus or minus 50 years. Why that happened is rather difficult to see. If you ask the classical writers why it happened, they would say that they would give two reasons. One, that there was a great increase in population. The land couldn't hold the people anymore. So that what happened was that the younger sons had to go off and find land for themselves elsewhere. The other reason that the classical writers give is that these people, these Celts, north of the Alps, had got so used to all the luxuries coming up from the Mediterranean that they wanted to go and find them for themselves. Both of those things may in part be true. The archaeological evidence certainly suggests that the population was building and building and building. And what we know of the society at the time is that it was that warfare was endemic, and that it was very much a consuming society that maintained the level of the elite by the destruction of wealth. The elite had to be buried with large quantities of gold and other luxuries, and that was really draining the natural resource. And it may be that society, social demands were such that they virtually destroyed society. Society wasn't able to provide all this gold to maintain the social system, and the social system broke down. All these things probably combined to encourage the young men to take their followers, to amass a huge number of followers and just go out and seek their fortunes.
The numbers involved in these migrations were enormous. Tribes of 200,000 and 300,000 poured through the Alpine passes, raiding deep into the Italian peninsula. The Etruscan city Clusium was savagely attacked. The inhabitants appealed for help from the burgeoning republic to the south, Rome. Fearing that the Celts would advance on their city, they sent the required military aid. The defenses built against the Celts still stand. But they were puny and futile attempts to stem the Celtic hordes. The defenseless inhabitants sought refuge literally in the city walls. The Etruscan and Roman armies were routed. The Celts marched on to Rome. At the Battle of Allia, the forces of the Republic were annihilated, and the capital lay at the mercy of the Celts. They showed none. A 19th century artist captured the mood as Rome was ravaged. A century later, the most sacred site in Greece, Delphi, was under attack from another Celtic tribe. An army of 30,000 advanced to plunder the nation's treasures. Greek accounts vividly describe the assault, but tell also of the interjection of the gods. Earthquakes, thunderbolts, and avalanches from Mount Parnassus hit the Celtic camps. The Celts, in disarray, were driven mad, say the Greeks, and ended up fighting and slaughtering each other. Forced to retreat, they left 26,000 of their number dead or dying on the sacred site. The Iberian Peninsula. For years, it's proved a problem area for Celtic scholars. At least as far back as 2,500 years ago, Celtic tribes have inhabited the area. By the 3rd century BC, stone-built roundhouses show a thriving semi-urban population. And these people proudly claimed themselves to be Celts. But how did they get here? Unfortunately, no DNA records have been compiled for the inhabitants of Spain or Portugal. Doubtless they would show an influx of Moorish blood from Africa. It is very doubtful whether they would show an influx of peoples from Central Europe. And yet the Celts were here, and here they built their hill forts. But there is no evidence of mass immigration. The more likely explanation is that the Celtic society developed here was a local phenomenon, only affected by contact and trade with the Celtic world north of the Pyrenees. We know they spoke Celtic languages. This amazing discovery is among the first written record in Celtic. It has been deciphered, but sadly is nothing more than a mundane contract of land ownership. It reveals nothing of Celtic history or beliefs, but does provide evidence of the extent of Celtic languages.
The greatest extent of the Celtic peoples would have been around 200 BC, at which time they had spread as far east as central Turkey, around Ankara, and Celtic languages were spoken extensively in Spain, Britain and Ireland, all of what's now France, most of Germany, northern Italy, Central Europe, and so on. So a tremendous span. It would be, 2,000 or 3,000 miles. If you were to superimpose it on top of a map of the States or Australia, it would go from coast to coast, the span of Celtic languages.
This, then, was the Celtic world of Europe. It dominated the continent. Never an empire, some argue it spread even further. In the western outpost of China lived people totally unlike their neighbors. These are the Urumqis. They have none of the Mongoloid features of the Chinese who surround them. In this part of the world, they are unique. They and the mummified bodies of their ancestors. The classical descriptions of the Celts are of a tall people, muscular, fair-haired, white-skinned. That description fits the Urumqis perfectly. They still speak Tocharian, a language closely related to Celtic. The Celtic practice of human sacrifice took place. Here, a child, barely 5 years old, buried alive. This burial has other echoes of Celtic Europe. With the deceased, the appropriate feast for the other world. Painted nails, just like the Celtic women. Even the plaid designs of their clothing, so Celtic. Is it even remotely conceivable that Celtic culture spread this far? Another Celtic enigma? The Celts in China, conjecture. The Celts in Britain, fact. Yet again, there is no evidence of tribal migration from the continent. Rather, the evidence points to continuity from the past. Many Celtic hill forts go back to Bronze Age sites, and those who lived here spoke a Celtic language even older, an ancestry that has for too long been kept in the dark corners of British history. The inhabitants of Maiden Castle in Hardy's Wessex spoke a Celtic tongue, were part of a Celtic society. A society that developed its own particular style, even in fort building. Defense was important in troubled times. So too was display. Nowhere is the peculiarity of building styles more apparent than in Scotland and the Isles. The Great Brochs. Massive structures, elegant and tapering. Over 500 of them exist. Clearly tribal centers, home of the warrior chiefs. Warfare was an integral part of Celtic life. So too was all the paraphernalia associated with it. John Kenny has mastered the art of playing Celtic instruments. The carnix was the instrument of war. Designed to put the fear of the gods in the enemy, a group of them made an awful racket. In reality, a warning system. Keep clear. Atypical of the ritual of Celtic warfare, where strict rules applied.
They also fought in single combat, two warriors fighting each other while everybody else looked on, and from opposing sides or opposing tribes, or Celt against Roman, there was a lot of that. But they did observe rules of combat, and in single combat they would not. It would be totally immoral to bring in a third party to help one or other of the combatants. But they also did make great slaughter and decapitated their enemies and came home with the bleeding heads attached to their horses' necks and so forth. So I don't think there's any doubt about their ability to kill and to kill great numbers.
But there was another side to Celtic life.
I think before the farm began, it was the perceived view that the Celts were struggling to survive, they couldn't farm, they couldn't build, and it was all the gift of the Romans, this civilization kick. And over the last 30 years, since we've been carrying out our research, we've disproved this rather nonsensical view. The Celts were a powerful, organised society capable of exporting grain and leather to the continent, building huge houses, a really very successful society which occupied the whole of the country. Now, and you reckon these things are going to bed down okay with the new pegs?
Yes, I've used the dry pegs.
At Butser Ancient Farm Research Centre in Hampshire, the everyday life of the Celts has been meticulously pieced together.
How does that look from down there?
That's looking good.
Working from the detailed researches of the archaeologists, they've been able to reconstruct a small Celtic settlement. They're still building. On the continent, the houses were square or rectangular. In Britain, they are mostly circular. Sometimes quite large, with an additional porch. Winter heating was provided by an open fire. As they've discovered, it's amazingly effective, and since it does not have a hole in the roof, there is no fear of a fire. The smoke simply seeped through the thatch. These buildings could withstand all weather conditions. They had to. The sloping roofs are invariably thatched, an effective method which has persisted over 2,000 years to our own day. The circular walls are made of wattle and daub, again very effective, and providing a natural damp course. This size and type of settlement captures the everyday life of the Celts in Britain. This is normality. Warfare was the exception. Warriors, an elite class. At Butser, they've also examined in practice Celtic farming and animal husbandry.
The one thing we don't do is carry out experiments with animals, because I think that doesn't achieve anything at all. But what we do is keep the story of prehistoric sheep on the hoof here at the farm. So we start off with the mouflon sheep, and these are the earliest sheep in Europe. Then the Soay sheep, the domestic sheep of the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, the Manx Lofton and the Hebridean sheep, which are the mainstream Iron Age domestic sheep. And of course, at the end of the Iron Age, we come with the Shetland sheep. And these would be the sort of sheep that the Romans found when they came to this country, plus all the others as a mixture, because they didn't die out. And it's interesting, from the names themselves, apart from the mouflon, they all survived as discrete groups on the west coast of England and Scotland. So you've got the Isle of Man, you've got the Shetlands, you've got the Soay Island. Soay, in fact, means sheep island. So they're all there as relict populations, if you like.
On the better lands, grain was effectively cultivated, and the research at Butser has brought some interesting facts to light.
The cereals they grow were fascinating in themselves because one particular, Triticum dicoccum or emmer wheat, this occurs in the history of mankind somewhere about 7,500 BC. And really it's the foundation of all modern civilization, because without it we'd still be gatherer-hunters, still living in sympathy with our landscape as opposed to trying to dominate it. As far as the Celtic world is concerned, emmer wheat was the staple wheat. And what's particularly elegant about the research results is we've proven that their yield factor was probably somewhere in the region of 1 tonne to the acre. The national average yield in the United Kingdom in 1951 was 1 tonne to the acre. And so the argument runs quite simply that in the Iron Age they were growing cereals as well as they were immediately after the last World War. And when you think about the logic of it, there's no reason why they shouldn't. And it makes admirable sense of Caesar's comment that they were actually producing a surplus production that was going for export, probably to the continent.
This wealth supported an elite class and an elite art. This mirror is elaborately engraved in the Celtic style of complicated curves and patterns. The gold talks, Celtic symbols of authority. The designs echo the Celtic designs of the continent, but they are peculiarly British too. The magnificent Battersea bronze shield, patterns that appear to be duplicated are always strangely different. A fertile and profound imagination is at work. And this was no simple artifact of warfare. Celtic art was more than that.
It has deep meaning. It wasn't just art for art's sake. So when we find the British communities importing some of these things and beginning to make them themselves, it tells us pretty well that they are absorbing the belief systems of the continent as well.
Importing them, adapting them. They are as complicated as the art that's linked to them. Ireland. Here, things Celtic are not always what they seem. Dun Angus on Inishmore with its concentric defences is a peculiar Celtic fort, if fort it be. So too Navan Hill Fort in County Armagh, the Emain Macha of the Irish epics. It has all the characteristics of a hill fort, the earthwork ramparts that surround the enclosure. A typical hill fort entrance, but all is not what it seems.
If you look at these closely, you will find that even though they do consist of very, very significant and massive earthworks, ramparts enclosing the hill, you will find the very peculiar situation that the ditch is inside rather than outside the rampart. That is uphill rather than downhill. Now this doesn't make any sense whatsoever from a defensive point of view. So the general feeling, just on the basis of the earthworks and the position of the ditches, the general feeling is that these are ritual sites, or sites of some sort of sacred, non-secular significance.
Navan Fort overlooks this small lake, Loch na Shade, and it was to reveal more about the sacred nature of the site. Dredged from the waters of the lake, this magnificent trumpet. Other religious sites were to reveal their secrets, horse trappings, so delicately worked. A leather shield came from another lake site. And beautiful gold talks. All, it would appear, sacrificed to the gods, all showing common Celtic styles, but all also peculiarly Irish. In all things, the Celtic world has a commonality and a rich variety, a dualism reflected in its art. But how did this Celtic art style and the artistic techniques that created it get to Ireland?
I have pondered on this point many times, and it seems to me there are a number of possible explanations. One is that Irish craftsmen went abroad, learned the techniques of technology, learned the sort of artistic styles which were current abroad, and brought the ideas back. That's one possibility. And the other possibility is that a number of craftsmen came from outside, a very small number of craftsmen came from outside, brought the ideas, brought the new technology, brought the new art forms with them, established themselves in the country, and then the craftsmen in the country learned from these people. I would suggest that the second one is perhaps the more likely, but if we can accept that this is so, we must accept that the number of people who came in were tiny.
By the 2nd century BC, the Celts on the continent were developing urban centres. Numancia in Spain was one. It covered over 50 acres, its streets carefully planned in a grid pattern. The houses of stone foundations were built of mud-dried bricks. But a new empire was threatening the Celts. For 20 years, the inhabitants of Numancia withstood its pressure. Then, starved into submission, its armies destroyed, the town was razed and the survivors sold as slaves. The enemy was Rome. The young republic whose armies had been massacred by the Celts and whose capital had been ravaged by them was now a major force. Its leaders intent on world domination, they would have the discipline and imagination to achieve it. For 2 centuries, they had fought successive Celtic tribes and come out the losers. Now the balance was shifting. In Gaul, the Celts had developed substantial tribal states ruled by kings and high chiefs. Population was increasing, underpinned by an increase in agricultural production. New settlements appeared. The Romans called them oppida. Within their walls lived wealthy aristocrats, regulating a growing trade and able to support a guild of specialist craftsmen. Government and legal institutions existed. Some centres dominated their tribal neighbours, but there was no cohesive major Celtic power bloc as in Rome. They clung to their old religious beliefs, and in the oppida built their Celtic temples. They had no fear of Rome or of the Romans.
The main problem with the Romans, and this was a problem they were going to face all the time because the Celts were bigger men than the Romans were. The Romans being about 5 feet 6, the Celts being 2 or 3 inches taller than this on average. And the Roman had to develop something that they could stop these with. This type of weapon, the Romans call it the pilum. It's a long iron shank joined to a wooden haft. And what they do is when the 2 armies charge, at about 20 metres distance, the Romans throw these, and you could imagine them hurtling through the air, 20,000 of these, and when they hit the Celtic shields, this piece went right through the shield and got to the man behind it. This was their prime purpose. This, of course, caused tremendous confusion with the Celtic army, with the result that they stopped charging to defend themselves, and it was in this very, very short break that the Romans went in with their swords, mainly thrusting swords, and tried to cut them to pieces. They had tremendous success with this, and basically during their whole period of fighting the Celts, their tactics against the Celt never changed.
The expansionist nature of the Roman Empire made it inevitable that its near neighbor Gaul would be invaded. That invasion was headed by Julius Caesar. He had no sanction from the Senate to embark on his campaign, and on more than one occasion, his forces were defeated by the Celts.
The Celts should have won all these battles, all the great battles, but they just didn't have the discipline of the Roman army. Earlier, they were winning battles when they were fighting against the Greeks and so forth, but the Roman army was a very well-disciplined machine. They weren't allowed to drink alcohol while on a military expedition. They weren't allowed to eat meat. They lived on grain, and they weren't allowed to eat meat, whereas the Celts were inordinately fond of alcohol of every kind. They had all the power, but the Romans had the discipline.
The Celt relied a lot on literally charging the other side and bashing into them and, whirling his sword above his head and screaming his head off, and the sound of carnix is the raucous shriek of these weapons, and this sort of thing. They relied on this to upset the other side. Whereas the Romans opposing them a much more disciplined group of people. They know that they've got to stop the Celtic charge, and they are armed specifically to do this. They use a thrusting weapon, which allows them to get into the stomach of a man while he's swinging his sword above his head. You can go in for his stomach. And their fighting technique had been developed against the Celts over 350 years. They knew exactly who they were fighting, whereas the Celts didn't know who they were fighting. It was inevitable they'd lose.
At least the Celts now realized the need for unity to resist Caesar's advance. This place would be the all-important clash point of the enemies, the hill fort of Alesia. And the Celts had found a hero fit to lead them, Vercingetorix. He had the charisma to command the respect of the tribes, no small talent for one in his 20s. He had led several successful campaigns against Caesar and his armies. By 52 BC, he had amassed a confederate Celtic army well over 200,000 strong. Here at the massive hill fort of Alesia, they should have easily defeated Caesar, with his small army outnumbered 4-1.
Then he does the incredibly stupid thing of sending away his cavalry. He sends them home to their people to collect a relieving army. As long as his cavalry were there, the Romans could only build their fortifications on the hills, where the cavalry couldn't attack them, or actually on the slopes of the hills. The moment they send off the cavalry, Caesar has a free time to do whatever he likes.
Vercingetorix had made his first error. Caesar was quick to take advantage. Within a mere month, his troops built the enormous siege works surrounding the hill fort. A complicated pattern of pit traps were laid to halt the Celtic chariots. Then ditches, then ramparts of earth and timber with strategic defensive towers. Vercingetorix and his army were trapped on the hill fort, but they could have held it. He then made his last mistake.
This is where Vercingetorix shows his complete lack of generalship. He should have sacrificed every man he'd got to hold that hill, and he didn't. He let the Romans occupy it. And from that point, it was over.
Not even a relief force of 250,000 troops could break Caesar's defenses. Gaul had fallen. This marble statue in Rome is a copy of a Greek bronze. It depicts a naked and dying Celtic warrior, the heroism so admired in the victorious classical world. But Caesar showed no mercy. Vercingetorix was paraded through the streets of Rome and ritually executed. In Britain, Caesar's campaigns were small-scale, mere preludes. Maiden Castle is a dramatic example of what followed. In 43 AD, under the orders of the Emperor Claudius, a massive force was dispatched across the Channel. The Celts were completely wrong-footed, their elaborate defenses no match for the imperial forces of Rome. Near the entrance to Maiden Castle was unearthed evidence of the many who died violent deaths in their futile efforts to defend the site. Throughout southern Britain, the pattern was the same, but there were revolts. The new Roman port Londinium was attacked. The leader, the warrior queen Boudica. Denied her inheritance on the death of her husband, her daughters were raped, she herself flogged. Her tribe rallied to her cause, a fight to the death. And there were allies to hand. Modern-day Colchester was the site of a new Roman colony, Camulodunum. Its remains still stand, but its forces had been very heavy-handed with the Celtic tribe here. They willingly lined up with Boudica. The Celtic forces now facing the Romans were massive, but as usual, disorganized. In the ensuing battle, 80,000 Celts were massacred. Boudica and her daughters are still heroines. But heroines in defeat. And yet, there were other parts that did not fall to Rome. The Roman conquest of Celtic Britain was far more limited than many believe.